Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ignorant Intellectual on Media. Today, I thought we'd uh, do the fourth episode of my CD library, um, where we're getting down through the C's and into the B's finally. If you remember from if you've watched the previous videos, I've taken pretty much all of my CDs off my shelves to make room for my movies because my movie library is expanding crazily, and I need the room to put up my movies, and I'm more into my movies presently than I am my music. What I do with my music basically is take the CD and transfer it into an MP3 file, put it on a flash drive, and put it in my car because that's where I listen to all my music. I don't really listen to much in the house. It's too busy and it's difficult to listen to music in the house with all the distractions. But anyway, um, so I boxed them all in a bunch of different boxes, and the first box contains all the numbers, all the A's, all the B's, and most of the C's. But when I was taking it off my shelf, obviously I started alphabetically, so I put the numbers and the A's at the bottom, and the B's in the middle, and then the C's at the top, because that's just the way you're stacking it, right? So going through it now, I'm going in the opposite direction. So I'm starting at C and going down to A, and then I'll move on to the next box, which has the rest of C and D and so on and so forth. Um, so it's kind of going alphabetically by artist or band, but not specifically alphabetically, right? Um, so we're coming to the end of the C's in this box. I know there's more C's in the next box at the bottom of that box, but then D and maybe E would be on top of it. But anyway, so today we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. We're going to do 18 CDs. Um, and we'll get through all the C's for this box and get into some of the B's as well. So um, should be some fun. All right, so let's first start. All right, as as you may notice, I put a little sticky note on every one of the albums to remember when the album came out, the dates. Sometimes they're hard to remember, and maybe little notes on special things about that album that I want to remember. But when you're recording, sometimes your brain goes blank when you're trying to remember certain things, right? So it's good to leave to do little sticky notes of little notes that you want to remember. Anyways, okay. So the first album is a C album. It's Tracy Chapman's self-titled first album, and it came out in 1988. All right. So um, I've decided, this being the fourth, all right, and I'm starting to get used to going through these CDs. Um, I'm going to put a an emphasis on the CDs that I find great, and then maybe if you have similar taste to me, if you're listening to the music that I'm showing you, whether it's on Spotify or iTunes, or you're picking up CDs as well, like I do, um, maybe you'll gain a taste similar to mine. And then when I highlight an album, a CD that I find great, um, maybe those are the ones. Those are the ones maybe you'll chase first or whatever, right? So, but we'll see. I don't know. You may have different tastes than I do. Music, see, one person's greatest uh, album of all time is another person's, man, that's a piece of shit. You know what I mean? So tastes are so eclectic, right? But there is, I mean, if you ever want to listen to music and you don't know anything about music, maybe you're in your teens and you're starting to get into music, or maybe you're in your early 20s and you've been in university and college, and that's what you concentrated on. You put aside any girlfriends, you put aside any um, you know, free time, and concentrated on your studies until you got through that. Now you're, you found a job, maybe you're looking for work, and now you're getting more into, the cultural aspects of humanity, right? And so you're wondering what music out there is really good, right? Well, my suggestion to you is now, I don't know how many young people actually listen to actual albums anymore. Mostly they listen to, if they're anything like um, my 20-something-year-old daughter, they'll listen to singles, individual songs that they search and find out maybe on YouTube or on Spotify or other streaming services, maybe they'll put on like a playlist that the streaming service suggests, and then they just kind of listen to individual songs that come up, almost like listening to the radio, right? So, um, and then they don't go any further than that. But if you become like really into music, music is still produced mostly in this form, all right, in albums. Now, they'll take certain songs off of these albums and they'll put them out as singles, and you'll hear them on the radio, or maybe you'll hear them on Spotify or wherever. But I know the format is changing, and albums aren't as important as they used to be. But still, albums are the way that you, um, I mean, for ever since the LP was created from the 78, where the 78 you may get one or two songs on one side and then you flip it over, maybe get one or two songs on the other, but mostly it's just one song on each side. When they got the technology to actually make LPs 33 rotations per minute, where you could fit like 20 to 30 minutes on each side of the platter, the album was created, right? And albums took over and became the standard form of listening to music. Now they put out the single 45s that you pick up, where it had an A side and a B side, but the album is what you would end up picking up at some point, right? So anyway, and then it turned into a CD album instead, right? Anyway, so this album came out in 1988, and maybe um, my whole spiel there was to point out that I have a lot of CDs. Okay, I have a lot of music, but there's some music that just hits the echelon, the top of my musical taste, and what I think is a great album. And I'm going to highlight those from now on. I haven't come across too many. There's a couple of Leonard Cohen albums that I've highlighted, and some others, but I wasn't really thinking whether I should highlight it as one of the greatest albums. In my opinion, if I was to make the greatest albums of all time, what albums would be on that list? This is one of them, and every time I come across an album that I find to be one of those, I will point it out to you, and maybe those are the ones that you can look for first if you're just starting out in music. All right, so this album came out in 1988, and I distinctly remember the first time I heard this album. All right, that's how good it is. Some albums will just grab you right from the start. And I was having a Guinness, or was it a Kilkenny? No, it was a Kilkenny in the basement of an Irish pub, or was it an English pub? Anyways, it was an English pub. No, no, it was an Irish pub. An Irish pub in the basement in the downtown area of the city that I live in. All right, and the city that I live in is a very popular tourist city. So you come across a lot of tourists. And I was shooting pool with these two guys from London, I think they were, uh, and they were complaining about Indian people, which kind of put me off on them, right? And now I've been over to London myself, and in my personal experience, wasn't a very friendly city. But anyway, so I was shooting pool with these guys, having a Kilkenny, because at that time that was my favorite beer to drink. And it's an Irish beer. It's a cream ale. It's very good. It's kind of sweet as well as kind of bitter. Anyways, I digress. So, and the bartender put this album on, and I listened to it, and I would go into that bar frequently at that time for a period of probably 5 or 6 months at that time, and he would put that album on over and over. And I finally asked him what that album was, and it was this one. And this is one of the greatest albums of all time. All right. Like I said, came out in 1998. Tracy Chapman, she's a singer, a songwriter, an American singer songwriter, and this album is all about being poor and being black, and how that affects you living in the United States. And do I relate to being female? No. Do I relate to being black? No. But I do relate to the poor side of it. All right, because I grew up very poor, and I do relate to some other things in this album, and it struck me. And her voice is like, it's not a high voice; it's a lower tone voice, and because of that, I don't know why it just grabs a hold of you. Her voice does, and it pulls you in, and then you listen to the music, like "Fast Car," which is probably her most famous song. And if you haven't heard that song, just go on Spotify or whatever and listen to "Fast Car," and then maybe that'll open Tracy Chapman to you if you haven't listened to anything by Tracy Chapman. Her best albums are her first one, which is this one, and her fourth one. Okay, um, I in the previous video to this one, so number three, you'll see that fourth album. I I reviewed that fourth album, but this one out of those two are the greatest ones. This is the greatest one by her, and some of the highlights of this is talking about a revolution, and that's about black people standing up for their rights. Fast cars, relationship between a girl and her boyfriend and, or her husband, and he deals with his crushed dreams or not wanting to grow up in a world that doesn't want him by driving his car fast, right? So behind the wall, baby, can I hold you? Mountains of things. She got her ticket. Anyways, it's just one great song after another great song, and I can't emphasize enough how great this album is. It's one of the greatest albums of all time, and it's one of my top greatest albums in a list of albums that if I was to make, this one would be included. All right. So that's Tracy Chapman's self-titled album from 1988. Next up is a French Spanish guy um, who came out with uh, this is his first solo album from his band. His name is Manu Chao, and it's called Clandestino. And I was put on this gentleman by a girlfriend of mine um, who really likes European and international music because she's from, where is she from? She's from like Switzerland, Germany, around that area. Anyway, so she, so I bought this on her recommendation. I listened to it. I thought it was really good. Do I remember anything about it now? Because I haven't listened to it since. No, but if you, uh, like I said, I put all my music on a flash drive, and this album's on that. But I haven't heard this album since the first time I listened to it. When I first listened to it, I listened to it a bunch of times. Then I moved on to more music, and I haven't heard it on a flash drive yet, and on one of the flash drives that I have. So I'll eventually get to the album again. But this came out in 1998, and it's his first solo album. And the biggest issue, if it is an issue, I mean, if you listen to the music is very, very good. But he sings, most of his songs are not in English; they're in French or Spanish or other languages. But I mean, people all over the world love this guy. So uh, I've never had any. It didn't blow me away enough for me to go search out and find any other of his albums. That's the only album of his that I have. Next up is one of the great, country soul artists of all time, and that's Ray Charles. And this is his last album, put out in 2004, um, before his death. And basically, this is a duet album where he invites a whole bunch of different singers, which are all on the front: Elton John, Norah Jones, B.B. King, Gladys Knight, Diana Krall, Canadian, Natalie Cole, Michael McDonald, and the list goes on and on. All right, and um, there's 12 songs on this, all with a guest playing and singing with Ray Charles, and it's a very good album. Now, is it his best album? No, his best album would be his interpretation of country music. I can't remember. It was a double album. What the hell was the name of that? Came out in the 50s. Anyways, if it pops into my head, I'll mention it. Or I'll just put it down here when I'm editing this video. All right, so this is Genius Loves Company, and it came out in 2004. Next up is Chavez Ride the Fader, which is their second album. All right, and it's their last one. They only had two albums. They had Gone Glimmering, which was their first one that came out in 1995, and this one, which is their second, and it came out in 1996, and it's called Ride the Fader. Now, I don't know much about this band. It came in, if you watched any of my previous videos, I bought this really large, like around 500 CD collection off this girl for like $50, and it contained a lot of indie rock, Canadian and outside Canada. And this was one of those CDs. So this is an underground like math rock post punk kind of band from the 90s, in and around New York City, and they put out two albums, but they never hit it big anywhere. But she had this album in that collection, so it's on one of my flash drives, and I'll listen to it as I go through all my flash drives in my car. So I haven't listened to it yet. Have you heard of this band? Have you listened to it? What do you think of it? You think it's pretty good? You think I'm going to enjoy it? Chavez, Ride the Fader. All right. Next up is a Canadian guy who made his name in being the lead singer and songwriter for Alexis on Fire, right? That Canadian band. And his name is Dallas Green, and this was his side project while being in Alexis on Fire. And this is his second album. It came out in 2008, and it's called "Buy Me Your Love." Although it doesn't say "Buy Me Your Love," it just has "City and Color," which is um, he said he wasn't comfortable putting Dallas Green on any of his albums. So what he did was he put City and Color as the name of his solo stuff. City being because his first name is Dallas, which is a city, and color being green, which is a color, right? So City and Color. I have not heard this album yet. As I said, all this stuff is on a flash drive, and I'm just going through each flash drive. Now each flash drive is 32 gigs, so it fits hundreds of albums. So it takes a while to go through a flash drive. It'll probably be years before I get through all. I think I have 12 of them presently in my collection. So I'll see how good this. Have you heard this album? Tell me what you think of this album if you've heard it. All right. And Alexis on Fire is one of the Canadian bands that if you're not in Canada, uh, you may want to check out if you haven't heard them. All right. So next up is Leonard Cohen. Now I've done some Leonard Cohen albums on the previous videos, and here I have four more of them. All right. So uh, let's show them all at once. All right. So this is his earliest. This is his third album. All right. Dear Heather. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. All right. Um, Dear Heather. This is his 11th album. All right. It's called Dear Heather. All right. 10 New Songs is his 10th album. All right. And it came out in 2001. Dear Heather came out in 2004. And then Popular Problems, which is his 13th album, came out in 2014. Now these three albums, I don't think I've listened. I think I've listened to this one once or twice, but the other two albums I haven't listened to yet. I'm slowly going through his discography, but what happens? It's so funny. What happens with Leonard Cohen is you start out with his early, like 1967, songs of Leonard Cohen, and then he had another album. What the hell was the name of that one? The Songs of Leonard Cohen, and then I can't remember the second album. But this is his third album, Songs of Love and Hate. All right. No, Songs in a Room, Songs from a Room. Songs from a Room was his second album. That came out in '69. This one came out in '71. What happens is you listen to Leonard Cohen and his early stuff, you listen to the album, then bang, you're hooked. All right. And you listen to it over and over and over and over again. All right. And then you go, okay, I've listened to this one enough, which is like 5 years later. I'm kidding. I'm just exaggerating. And then you pick up his second album. All right. And then you listen to that one, and something on that album grabs you as well. And so you listen to that one over and over and over again. All right. And then by the time you finish being with that one, you go, I kind of missed the first one. So you listen to the first one again for a while, and you listen to the second one again because you listened to the first one for a while, and then maybe you jump to the third one, and that's this one, and then you listen to this one over and over and over again because all of them are such great albums, right? And and then you listen to the first one again, and then you listen to the second one again, and then you listen to the third one again. And by the time you finish that three, it's like 5 years later or whatever, right? And then finally you're going to move on to the next album, then you get stuck on that album. But his first three albums I would place, in my top greatest albums of all time. And this one is an extremely good album. So there's probably maybe four or five albums that I would put uh, in my top list. His first three albums, the 1984 album, I'm Your Man, is another one, and Various Positions is another one. But I haven't listened to all of his albums yet, even though I've been listening to him for like over 20 years, right? I just keep returning to his early stuff because it's so good. And then when I move on to other things and I get an urge to listen to Leonard Cohen, I don't have an urge to listen to his more recent stuff. I have an urge to go back and listen to the stuff that I haven't heard in a few months and re-listen to it again. Now this one has Avalanche on it, Last Year's Man, Dress Rehearsal Rag, Diamonds in the Mine, Love Calls You by Your Name, Famous Blue Raincoat, Sing Another Song, Boys, and Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc is one of his greatest songs. It's about Joan of Arc, right? And it's basically about her reconciliation to her own death while she's on, on the stake, being burned, right? So it's a pretty intense song. And but the greatest song on this album is called "Famous Blue Raincoat," and it's one of the most. Go on Spotify, listen to "Famous Blue Raincoat," listen to the lyrics, and tell me that that isn't one of the greatest. That Cohen isn't one of the greatest lyricists of all time ever in the history of music. Tell me, you can't not tell me that. If you did, I'd call you a liar. That is a stunning song. It's one of the greatest songs ever written, and he even thinks that it's incomplete. He didn't think he wrote it all that, but listen to it. All right, there's sections in that song that will create imagery in your mind that will actually hurt your heart. It will hurt your heart, and if you actually listen to that song and its lyrics, and a tear doesn't come to your eye, um, I don't know. Maybe you're heartless. I have no idea. But if you listen to that song, it's called "Famous Blue Raincoat," and you don't get an emotional response to that song and think it's great and become a Leonard Cohen fan for the rest of your life, maybe I'm unique in that, but I don't think so because every time I talk about Leonard Cohen, somebody always brings that song up and says, "My God, that's such an amazing song." So go on Spotify or YouTube and put on "Famous Blue Raincoat" and tell me any different on if you think that is a great song or not. Leave it in the comments. All right. So this is his third album, came out in 1971. All right. So that's Leonard Cohen. All right. Next up is Jim Bryson, and probably 99% of you have never heard of Jim Bryson. Um, he's basically one of the traveling musicians for Kathleen Edwards. Kathleen Edwards is one of the bigger names of female uh, singer-songwriters in Canada that don't have a first name named Sarah, right? So, um, and she's traveled all over North America playing her song, Kathleen Edwards, and he's like the guitarist and collaborated with Kathleen Edwards, but he has put out a bunch of solo albums. This being his second, it's called The Northside Benches, and he is from uh, Canada's capital, Ottawa, and I've watched him live numerous times um, when he's done his travels. All right, so he'll tour with Kathleen Edwards when it goes on tour, but he'll also travel around on his own and play venues as well. But you'll have difficulty finding his CDs. I picked this one up at one of his concerts, and it's called the North Side Benches. Now, the North Side Benches, if you're from Ottawa and you're a CFL fan, um, Lansdowne Park is where the Rough Riders, which is the previous incarnation of the CFL team in Ottawa. They were called the Rough Riders one time. Now they're called the Red Blacks, which I could never understand where the hell they got that name from, Red Blacks. But anyways, um, and the stadium where uh, the field faces east and west, but the uh, but the stands are on the north and the south side of the football field, right? So this is the north side benches. So he's a north side fan. Now, I don't know the details on what makes you a north side or a south side fan. It just means you have a preference for one side of the stadium or the other side of the stadium. It doesn't mean you're not like a Rough Riders or a Red Blacks fan. It just means you like either side of the stadium, right? So um, I don't know where that came from, but that's basically where he got the name of this album from. Now, this album came out. When did this album come out? I think it was 2008, if I remember correctly. Um, and if you like singer-songwriters with he doesn't have a low guttural voice like Leonard Cohen or a high voice. He has like one of those middle voices, and um, it's kind of feel good. It makes you feel good when you listen to his music. It's it's a bit catchy. It moves well, and you feel good when you're listening to it. So that's what always attracted me to Jim Bryson. And his first album was called The Occasionals. This was his second album, and I found his third album. But do you think I can remember his name? It's not in this. Remember the name of his third album. I can't remember the name of it, but that was the last album that I picked up from him. So, um, but if you ever do come across this, the North Side Benches, pick it up. Tell me what you think. All right. Next up is Jeff Buckley, and I got two albums from, well, three albums actually. All right, so I got three albums from him. I have the Jeff Buckley collection. Now, Jeff Buckley only put out one studio album, and then he died of a drowning. He was out swimming in the Mississippi River for some reason. It's kind of strange, fully clothed, and he ends up like getting hit by a boat or something happened to him, and he ends up drowning. All right, and they find him a few days later. So he only came out with one album, and it was called Grace. So this collection is kind of some live songs, some studio songs of Grace and some other music that he did. But basically, if you pick up Grace, you have everything you need um, from Jeff Buckley. And speaking of Leonard Cohen with Jeff Buckley, so here's Grace right there. All right. So this is a times two. It's called. It's you'll find these CDs around where they'll put two albums on in one package, and it's a paper package. So it's in a plastic bag to protect it. But it has Grace, which is his only album. But that again, remember when I mentioned I would mention an album that if I think it's one of the greatest albums of all time, Grace is one of them. All right. This is his live album that his that was recorded in a whole bunch of different venues. They took a whole bunch of different venues uh, when he was doing the tour for Grace, and they recorded a bunch of his songs and put a bunch of songs from different venues that he did live into one like compilation live album, which is called Mystery White Boy, and this came out in 2000. Grace came out in 1994, so he was dead by the time this live album came out. So basically, the only album that he put out was this one here. All right, and he was working on a second album, and so I think they released that second album um, in rehearsal form or whatever. Um, but I haven't found it yet to listen to it. So, but basically, Grace is what you want. And now I mentioned Leonard Cohen. The reason why I mentioned Leonard Cohen is because he does a version of Hallelujah, which is one of Leonard Cohen's greatest songs. All right, and that go on Spotify and listen to Hallelujah by Jeff Buckley, and that is the greatest rendition of that song, better than Leonard Cohen's, better than anybody else. And there's been numerous artists that have covered that album, covered that song, just like most of Leonard Cohen's music has been covered by others. Like Famous Blue Raycoat was covered by Kim Warren's. Kim Warren, you know the one. Anyway, uh, so Grace is the album that you want to get. It's one of the greatest albums of all time. Came out in 1994, if I remember correctly. And on it is Hallelujah, but Lilac Wine is extremely good on that album. Um, So Real is really good. Um, and Hallelujah, one of the greatest songs of all time, written by Leonard Cohen. But um, remember how Otis Redding came out with the song Respect, and then Aretha Franklin did a cover of it, and now it's basically an Aretha Franklin song. Well, I think that's what Jeff Buckley did with Hallelujah. He basically took that song over, and now when you listen to that song, you don't hear Otis Redding, you always hear Aretha Franklin. Just like with Aretha Franklin and the Bruce Springsteen song Pink Cadillac, it's another Aretha Franklin song, even though Bruce Springsteen did it first. It's one of his songs, but Aretha Franklin did a cover of it, basically took it over, right? Jeff Buckley did that with Hallelujah. Listen to it on Spotify. Tell me any different because it is an amazing song the way that he does it. All right. So that's Jeff Buckley. Up next is an indie rock band from Boise, Idaho called Built to Spill. And this is their fourth album, and it's called Keep It Like a Secret. Now, I have not listened to this album, but I eventually will on one of my flash drives, as I keep saying. There's a bunch of music that I have not listened to, and I'm always open to you leaving comments in these videos to tell me, oh man, you really got to listen to this album. Or I listened to this album when I was like 16 years old, and it just blew me away, and it's one of my favorite albums ever since. Or that band is shit. Just avoid it. They're a piece of crap. You know, any of that kind of comments that I welcome. but I will eventually come across this album as I'm going through my flash drives and listen to the music, like I said, right? So there's a good amount of these CDs that I have not listened to, but there's a good amount that I have, and it's the CDs are in the thousands, right? We've already gone through about 50 CDs, and um, we've only done some of the C's, right? And now we're into the B's, right? So, um, and that's only in the rock section. I still have a punk, hip hop, jazz, blues, and other genres of music that I haven't gone to yet either, right? So they're in different boxes. Anyway, so this is called Built to Spill. They're kind of an indie rock band uh, that were popular back in the 90s and the early 2000s, I think, if I remember correctly. But I have not heard anything from them, and this is, I think, the only album that I have by them. And I have that album for the same reason why I have other albums that I'm mentioning that I haven't listened to yet, because of the 500 CDs that I bought off that girl for like $50. All right. Anyway, so let me know what you think of this album if you've listened to it. Do you think it'll become one of my favorite albums? All right. So now we're going to do one of the greatest singer-songwriters of the female persuasion from the 1980s. All right. And there's nobody bigger than her. I'm sorry, but she has the most unique voice. If you ever listen to Bjork, you ever listen to Bjork, the Icelandic singer? It doesn't matter if you listen to any of her songs. Once you hear one of her songs and her voice, any other song that you hear, whether it's on the speakers at a grocery store or in a person's on the radio in the car, or somebody's listening to it uh, when you go to a party and it's on Spotify playing off some speakers or whatever. Whenever you hear a Bjork song, you're going to know it's Bjork just by the uniqueness of her voice. She has a stunning voice. And Kate Bush, all right. So I have one, two, three, three albums by Kate Bush. All right, all right. So I have her first album, which is called The Kick Inside. All right, and then I have her fourth album. I think this one is her fourth. Let me make sure. No, it's her fifth album. It's called Hounds of Love, and this is her greatest album. Okay, and then I have a compilation album of hers that came out in 1986 called The Whole Story. So um, I'm not a big fan of. If you've listened to previous videos of these CDs, I'm not a huge fan of compilation uh, albums, especially if they come out when the artist has put out less than five albums, right? So, but this is her fifth, and then they put out this one, all right? So this is basically a compilation of all her best music from her first five albums. So this one I approve of, and it's one of the greatest. If you were to take all the compilation albums of all time and put them in a list, just compilation albums, so you would put in something like Legend by Bob Marley would be one of them. What would be another one? The CCR green labeled one. That was a great compilation album, and this one would be in there also. But like I said, compilation albums are just usually it's a way for record companies to put out an album without putting out any new music and make some money off of it. So they made a ton of money off this one, and because Kate Bush is such a great artist, anyway. So Kate Bush is probably the greatest artist of the '80s of the female artist of the '80s. All right, and this is her first album, and this one came out in 1978. So it actually, like so many other great '80s artists, they started in the '70s. The Police started in the '70s. Prince started in the '70s. Michael Jackson, when he went solo, started in the late '70s. Right? They all started in the late '70s. Right? So um, Talking Heads started in the late '70s, and then they become huge in the '80s. Right? So I think the only '80s band that was a great band in the '80s that started in the '80s that everybody knows at least is U2, right? Wouldn't it be U2? Because they started in the '80s. They didn't start in the late '70s and became big in the '80s. But anyway, so this came out in 1978, and it's their first. It's the one that has what's the name of that song? It's so good. Um, Wuthering Heights. It's song number 6 on this CD. All right, but it also has The Man with the Child in His Eyes, which is a really good song. The saxophone song. All right, and Them Heavy People is another one that's really good. So this one is one of her best, but this one is her best. All right, and this is her greatest album of all time, and I would include this album in my greatest albums of all time list. 1985, Hounds of Love. It's the one that has Running Up That Hill, right? Running Up. I can't sing it right. Copyright. I have to look into that. See if you're allowed to like hum or sing a song that you don't have the rights to. Just as it's fair use, isn't it? If you're explaining something. Anyways, we'll see. Anyway, so this one on the first side, it has the songs Running Up That Hill, Hounds of Love, The Big Sky. Remember that song, The Big Sky? Amazing song. Mother Stands for Comfort, and Cloud Busting, which is another great song. And then when you get to the second side, all right, she gave it a name. It's called The Ninth Wave, and it basically is like a conception album, like a concept album. Um, Songs that are about a woman who's on a boat in the middle of the night on the ocean by herself. All right, and it contains a bunch of songs. And this CD, if you can find this CD, actually has bonus tracks on it. It has six more songs on it, which are a lot of the 12-inch mix of Running Up That Hill and some other songs. So this one even gives you even more. So if you can find this CD specifically, all right, I mean you get like over an hour's worth of her music. And this is, like I said, I would include it in one of the greatest albums of all time, all right? Um, so that's Kate Bush, all right? Next up is Can. And Can is one of the greatest krautrock bands, probably started krautrock, that genre of music, krautrock. And this is their third studio album. And you tell me, people say it's it's the album that everybody pronounces incorrectly. So what is it? Bamyasi? Ege Bamyasi? Is that how you pronounce it? Anyways, there's a proper way to pronounce it, but nobody knows how to pronounce it until somebody tells them and say, no, this is how it's pronounced. Say it this way from now on. I haven't come across a person to do that yet, right? So Can is one of the great German bands, krautrock bands of the 70s. And this is their third studio album. I think it came out in 1972. Yes, 1972. Um, it came out after Monster Movie, Tango Mango, and then it was this one, and then their greatest album of all time. And when I come across that album, maybe I don't, because I put a lot of the greatest albums I think on my stuck on my walls. So at the end of going through all my CDs, I'll show you the walls and go over those albums as well. But this one is one of their best albums. But Future Days is the greatest album of all time. And I haven't listened to this enough. See, the thing about Future Days is that was the first album I ever listened to by Can, Future Days, which is the album after this one, their fourth album. And it's kind of like they grab a hold of that kind of spacey rock, um, mellow, flowing type uh, of music that was popular during the mid '70s, right? You had a whole bunch of different bands that put out like space kind of rock albums, and some of them are more rock oriented, but others are more like mellow, floaty kind of music, right? And Can is um, one of those albums. Future Days, I mean, is one of those albums. So my introduction to Can was that Future Days album, and then I started listening to their other stuff like Tago Mago and this one, and they sound nothing like Future Days. And so the shock of it kind of put me off their other stuff, and I haven't come around to it yet. So I've only listened to this album a couple of times, um, and Tago Mago a couple of times, and I've never listened to Monster Movie because I haven't found it. But um, many consider this their greatest album, not Future Days. So I mean, I have it on the flash drive, so it's going to come up eventually, and maybe I'll give it a second listen. But at this present time, whenever I want to listen to Ken, I always go to Future Days, and that's as far as I go. So I know I'm probably missing out, but like I said, I tried them, and then there's so much music, right? That when you hit something that you like, you start listening to that a lot. And when you hit something that you don't like, that you maybe should like or would like if you're younger or older, depending, because music is so age centric as well, right? Um, there's music that I listened to in my teens that I would never listen to, or I'd only listen to it out of nostalgia now that I'm in even when I was in my 40s or whatever, right? So, but this one is considered one of the great albums, but I wouldn't put it in one of the greatest albums of all time. I would put Can's Future Days in that list, all right? And that is the second last album, all right? Tell me about this album, why you think it's great. Any music lover knows that album, and especially a music lover that really likes krautrock. That's one of the seminal albums in krautrock. Tell me why that is such a great album, and maybe I can listen to it with that vein, and maybe it'll blow my mind or whatever. Wow, okay, I get it now, and then I'll enjoy it. All right. So now there's a band in the '80s that started in the '70s again. One of the greatest '80s bands. It's called the Talking Heads, and the lead singer for the Talking Heads was a guy named David Byrne, and he came out with this album. All right. Um, when was this album? 1989. All right. So, and this is his first solo album. All right. And I don't know if people like this album or not. I haven't listened to it. I have listened to Talking Heads. My favorite album of theirs is, I think, '78. You know, the one that has 7/8 on it. I think that's probably my favorite album of theirs. Um, but you know, it Talking Heads music is consistently good throughout their discography, right? And I have not listened to this album. Have you listened to it? It came out in 1989. It's his first solo album. It's mostly like Latin music. So it's like he traveled around, Latin America and South America, and picked up a bunch of different type of Latin music and played it with guests. Um, so it's basically an introduction to Latin music for people who haven't listened to Latin music before. Like he went to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and Brazil to get this music, right? So supposedly it's a very good album, but I'm not sure. I haven't heard it yet. I will eventually hear it on one of my flash drives. And that is number 18. And that's all of the albums that we will do for this segment or this episode. If you liked it, maybe I introduced you some good music like Jeff Buckley's Grace or Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate are the first two that pop into my head. From that, Kate Bush's Hounds of Love. Um, these albums, Tracy Chapman's self-titled album, these albums are some of the greatest albums ever made, greatest albums of all time. Now, with the amount of music that has come out since recorded music has been recorded, you know, there is a large number of albums that are, you could probably do a top 1,000 um, albums of all time and still miss out on some of them, right? But if you did, like I think there's a book called 1001 albums that you have to listen to before you die, and I bet you they probably missed some even in that book, right? So you can there's a lot of them, but out of the, let's say, 1,000, there's millions upon millions of albums, right? So it actually is quite small, but those are four albums from this list, all right? So you got Tracy Chapman's self-titled album, you have Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate, you have Jeff Buckley's Grace, and you have Kate Bush's Hounds of Love are the four that I would add to the greatest albums of all time list. All right, and we'll go with another episode in the near future. All right, and thank you for joining me. If you liked it, leave a thumbs up. If you want to join me on my journey through all this music and movies and other media, um, feel free to press the subscribe button, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you for joining me, and bye for now.